It began so long ago that no one in the family could recall the exact moment when words hardened into grudges and grudges into something far more dangerous. Some said it started with land, a stretch of earth that lay between two brothers, neither willing to yield even an inch of it. Others claimed it was about inheritance, an old will written in hurried ink that favored one line of blood over another. But the truth is, feuds rarely begin with one clear spark. They grow, gathering kindling over years, fueled by slights both real and imagined, until one day the fire becomes too large to contain. For decades, the family lived in uneasy proximity. Weddings became arenas of silent warfare, funerals quiet battlegrounds where eyes lingered too long and words were clipped short. A smile was never just a smile, it was a weapon, sharpened with sarcasm or scorn. Neighbors whispered about them, shaking their heads at the stubbornness that seemed to seep into each generation. Children were raised not with fairy tales, but with stories of betrayal and warnings about the others. To marry across the divide was unthinkable, to forgive was weakness. The feud became not just part of their history, but part of their blood. Years passed, and still it simmered. A barn mysteriously burned one summer night. Livestock went missing. A window shattered in the dark hours before dawn. No one ever proved who was responsible, but everyone knew. There were confrontations in town, sharp exchanges that left bystanders frozen in their tracks. Yet somehow, for all the fury, no line was crossed beyond repair until the night when it was. It was late autumn, and the wind carried with it the brittle scent of burning leaves. A family gathering had drawn both sides into the same small town, too close for the comfort of men who had spent lifetimes sharpening hatred. Alcohol flowed easily, loosening tongues, and with it came words that could not be swallowed back. An insult hurled in the wrong moment, an accusation that touched upon old wounds, and suddenly the weight of decades came crashing down all at once. The fight began with shouts, but shouts turned to shoves and shoves to fists. By the time the gun was drawn, no one could recall exactly who had thrown the first blow. What they remembered was the silence that followed the shot, a silence so heavy it seemed to press the breath from everyone's chest. One body fell, blood seeping into the cracked wooden floor, and with it fell any hope of reconciliation. The sheriff who arrived at the scene knew the family well. He had grown up hearing the stories, too, and he had always wondered what end they would come to. When he saw the body, he only shook his head. It was bound to happen, he muttered, more to himself than to the deputies. In the weeks that followed, there were arrests and trials, whispers in the courthouse corridors, and headlines in the local paper. But behind all the procedures of justice was the deeper truth. The murder was not the act of one night or one man. It was the culmination of years, the weight of history pressing down on shoulders too weary to carry it. The feud had been the true killer, poisoning every meal, every gathering, every chance at peace until blood was the only language left. The family splintered after that. Some left town, unable to bear the shame or the memories. Others stayed, grimly tending the land that had once been the root of their discord, but now seemed only like cursed earth. The children who remained grew quieter, wary of repeating their parents' mistakes. But even they could not quite erase the shadow of what had come before. When they passed each other in town, there were nods and thin smiles, but beneath it lay a silence thick with all that had been lost. The feud was over, but not because forgiveness had been found. It ended because death had taken what pride and bitterness could not. And though the years continued on, the story lingered, passed down in hushed voices, a reminder that some games, if played too long, can only end one way. The years before the murder had been marked by a steady erosion of restraint, the kind that creeps in so quietly no one notices until the dam finally breaks. Family gatherings, once tolerated if not enjoyed, dwindled into rare events. The weddings of cousins who dared to invite both sides became tense performances, with each half of the church sitting rigidly apart, refusing to cross into enemy territory. Even funerals, where grief should have softened the edges, were sharp with tension. Mourners lowered their eyes not out of sorrow, but to avoid meeting the gaze of those they despised. The children, who should have been innocent, absorbed the bitterness like smoke into their lungs. They grew up learning not to cross certain yards, not to borrow from certain neighbors, not to trust a last name that sounded too familiar. They carried the feud like an inherited curse, passed down as naturally as eye color or bone structure. Some questioned it in whispers. Why do we hate them again? But their questions were always met with the same hardened silence. Because we do. Over time, anger became the very foundation of identity. For one man in particular, Thomas, who would one day pull the trigger, hatred was not just something he had been taught, but something he clung to as proof of loyalty to his blood. He grew up under the watchful shadow of his father, who never let him forget who the enemy was. When he was just a boy, he overheard his father mutter, "If you let them take an inch, they'll take your whole soul." The words etched themselves into his memory, a commandment stronger than scripture. But years have a way of grinding a man down. Thomas had dreams once, of leaving town, of studying law, of escaping the endless pettiness of the feud, but every attempt was dragged back by duty, by debt, by the unshakable weight of expectation. His resentment simmered, not only for the rival family, but for his own, who chained him to a fight he hadn't chosen. Still, he swallowed it, day after day, until that autumn night when the dam burst. The argument began as so many before it had, drunken words, half-truths, and slurs meant to wound. But this time something different sparked in Thomas, something hot and blinding. He no longer heard his rival's voice. He heard the voices of every man who had spat on his name, every relative who had reminded him of debts unpaid, every ghost whispering in his ear that he was not enough unless he fought. The weight of decades pressed down on him, and in that suffocating moment, he lifted the gun. The shot was final, but the silence afterward was worse. People froze, staring not just at the body sprawled on the ground, but at Thomas, who stood trembling, unable to believe what his hands had done. For the first time in his life, the feud was quiet. The shouting had ceased, the fists unclenched, and in that hollow stillness, everyone realized they had crossed into a place from which there was no return. The trial that followed tore the town apart. Some defended Thomas, insisting he had only done what fate demanded, that the other man's death was inevitable. Others condemned him, disgusted at how generations of pride had ended in senseless bloodshed. Old wounds reopened, sharper than ever. It wasn't just one life that had ended. It was the last illusion that their feud was anything less than a poison. Thomas spent the rest of his days behind bars, but even prison walls could not free him. He carried the weight of what he had done, replaying that night in endless loops until his mind grew brittle. He would never say it aloud, but deep in the darkest corners of his soul, he knew the truth. The feud hadn't been about land or money or honor. It had been about pride, and pride had devoured them all. The families dwindled after that. Younger generations left, seeking lives elsewhere, unwilling to inherit the sins of their fathers. The old homesteads fell into disrepair, barns sagging under the weight of time, fields left barren. Only the graves remained, lined in quiet rows, marking the cost of stubbornness. Visitors who passed through sometimes asked about the story, and the locals would shake their heads. It went on too long, they'd say. And, in the end, it cost them everything. The feud did not end with reconciliation, but with exhaustion. It ended in blood. And though the story faded into memory, the silence that followed carried its own warning. Some wars are never worth fighting, no matter how long you've been told they are. The feud's true roots lay buried further back than even the oldest living members could fully recall, tangled in a web of grievances and betrayals that had long since been distorted by retelling. Some claimed it began with the division of land when the patriarch of the family died, a careless stroke of ink that granted one brother fertile acres and the other little more than rocky soil. Others swore it began with a love affair gone wrong, a woman promised to one man who ran instead into the arms of his cousin. Still others whispered of money stolen, debts unpaid, and promises broken. But whatever the origin, the effect was the same. Two branches of a single bloodline turned inward, locked into a rivalry that consumed every generation that followed. In the early days, when the feud was still young, it carried with it a kind of vitality. The arguments were fierce, but they were also alive with energy, as though the families drew strength from their mutual hatred. One side prospered in farming, the other in trade, and both strove constantly to outdo the other. Barns were painted brighter, fences built higher, cattle bred stronger, not just for survival, but to prove superiority. Even their prayers were sharpened into weapons. In church, they bowed their heads with tight lips, asking God for blessings not just upon themselves, but curses upon their kin. As years folded into decades, the bitterness deepened, losing its edge of competition and turning to something darker. The next generation inherited not only names and land, but grudges that had become ritual. Fathers told sons of ancient insults as though recounting sacred scripture. Daughters learned to look away when the others passed by on the road. Schoolyards became battlegrounds where children fought wars they barely understood. Even marriages outside the family were chosen with care, alliances made to fortify one side against the other. The feud had become so ingrained that no one thought of ending it. Pride had long since swallowed reason. For some, hatred was easier than forgiveness. It required no compromise, no admission of weakness. And so the families carried it forward like a torch, not realizing that the fire would eventually consume them. By the time Thomas was born, the feud was not just history, it was expectation. He grew up on stories of stolen cattle, slashed tires, crops mysteriously blighted. He learned to glare before he learned to smile, to defend his name before he understood what it meant. He was told who his enemies were before he ever met them. As a boy, he once asked his mother, "Why do we hate them?" And she, weary and sharp, replied, "Because they hate us." That was all the answer required. But Thomas was not a cruel man by nature. He worked the land hard, respected the rhythms of the seasons, and quietly dreamed of escape. He wanted to build something of his own, free from the endless cycle that had consumed his father and grandfather. And yet, the older he grew, the more entangled he became. Every insult rekindled the fire. Every expectation laid upon him was another weight pressing him down. His family told him he was strong, a protector, but what they meant was that he must never yield, never soften, never forgive. The murder itself was not born in a single night, but in a lifetime of being told that hatred was his duty. The night of the gathering, when the insults flew and fists rose, it was as though every story, every lesson, every memory converged in a single moment. When he raised the gun, it was not just his hand that pulled the trigger, it was the hand of his father, his grandfather, and all the ghosts of his bloodline urging him on. When the smoke cleared and silence fell, what lay on the ground was not just a body, but the end of something that had stretched on for generations. The murder was not shocking because it was unexpected, but because it had always been inevitable. Everyone in town knew it, even if they had never said it aloud. In the years that followed, the story spread beyond the valley where the families had lived. It became a cautionary tale whispered to children in neighboring towns, a warning about pride, about grudges, about the way anger can curdle into fate. Outsiders shook their heads at the foolishness of it all. Two branches of one family destroying themselves over ancient wounds no one could clearly name. But those who had lived it, who had seen the looks and heard the words and carried the weight, knew better. It had never been about one moment, one slight, or one man. It had been about time itself, a long game played until there were no players left standing. And in the end, that was the bitterest truth of all, that the feud ended not in triumph for one side, nor reconciliation for both, but in silence.